side too. Looked at objectively, however, there was nothing at all about him to instill terror. As he grew older, he was not especially big nor strong. Ugly, true, but not so extremely ugly that people would necessarily have taken fright at him. He was not aggressive, nor underhanded, nor furtive. He did not provoke people. He preferred to keep out of their way. And he appeared to possess nothing even approaching a fearful intelligence. Not until the age of 3 did he finally begin to stand on 2 feet. He spoke his first word at 4. It was the word fishes, which in a moment of sudden excitement burst from him like an echo when a fishmonger coming up the Rue de Charonne cried out his wares in the distance. The next words he parted with were pelargonium, goat stall, Savoy cabbage, and Jacques Loreur, this last being the name of a gardener's helper from the neighbouring convent of the Filles de la Croix, who occasionally did rough, indeed very rough, work for Madame Gaillard, and was most conspicuous for never once having washed in all his life. Grenouille was less concerned with verbs, adjectives, and expletives. Except for yes and no, which, by the way, he used for the first time quite late, he used only nouns, and essentially only nouns for concrete objects, plants, animals, human beings, and only then if the objects, plants, animals, or human beings suddenly overcame him with their odour. One day, as he sat on a cord of beechwood logs, snapping and cracking in the March sun, he first uttered the word wood. He had seen wood 100 times before, had heard the word 100 times before. He understood it too, for he had often been sent to fetch wood in winter. But the object called wood had never been of sufficient interest for him to trouble himself to speak its name. It happened first on that March day as he sat on the cord of wood. The cord was stacked beneath overhanging eaves and formed a kind of bench along the south side of Madame Gaillard's shed. The top logs gave off a sweet, burnt smell, and up from the depths of the cord came a mossy aroma. In the warm sun, aromatic flakes of resin odour crumbled from the pine-wood planking of the shed. Grenouille sat on the logs, his legs outstretched and his back leaned against the wall of the shed. He had closed his eyes and did not stir. He saw nothing, he heard nothing, he felt nothing. He only smelt the aroma of the wood rising up around him to be captured under the bonnet of the eaves. He drank in the aroma. He drowned in it, impregnating himself through his innermost pores until he became wood himself. He lay on the cord of wood like a wooden puppet, like Pinocchio, as if dead, until after a long while, perhaps a half-hour or more, he gagged up the word, wood. He vomited the word up, as if he were filled with wood to his ears, as if buried in wood up to his neck, as if his stomach, his gorge, his nose was spilling over with wood. And that brought him to himself, rescued him only moments before the overpowering presence of the wood, its aroma, was about to suffocate him. He shook himself, slid down off the logs, and tottered away as if on wooden legs. Days later, he was still completely fuddled by the intense olfactory experience, and whenever the memory of it rose up too powerfully within him, he would mutter imploringly over and over, "Wood, wood." And so he learned to speak. With words designating non-smelling objects, with abstract ideas and the like, especially those of an ethical or moral nature, he had the greatest difficulty. He could not retain them, confused them with one another, and even as an adult used them unwillingly and often incorrectly. Justice, conscience, God, joy, responsibility, humility, gratitude, etc. What these were meant to express remained a mystery to him. On the other hand, everyday language would soon prove inadequate for designating all the olfactory notions that he had accumulated within himself. Soon he was no longer smelling mere wood, but kinds of wood: maple wood, oak wood, pine wood, elm wood, pear wood, old, young, rotting, mouldering, mossy wood, down to single logs, chips, and splinters, and could clearly differentiate them as objects in a way that other people could not have done by sight. It was the same with other things. For instance, the white drink that Madame Gaillard served her wards each day. Why should it be designated uniformly as milk, when to Grenouille's senses it smelled and tasted completely different every morning, depending on how warm it was, which cow it had come from, what that cow had been eating, how much cream had been left in it, and so on? Or why should smoke possess only the name smoke, when from minute to minute, second to second, the amalgam of hundreds of odors mixed iridescently into ever new and changing unities as the smoke rose from the fire? Or why should earth, landscape, air, each filled at every step and every breath with yet another odor, and thus animated with another identity, still be designated by just those three coarse words? All these grotesque incongruities between the richness of the world perceivable by smell and the poverty of language were enough for the lad Grenouille to doubt that language made any sense at all. And he grew accustomed to using such words only when his contact with others made it absolutely necessary. At the age of 6, he had completely grasped his surroundings olfactorily. There was not an object in Madame Gaillard's house, no place along the northern reaches of the Rue de Charonne, no person, no stone, tree, bush, or picket fence, no spot, be it ever so small, that he did not know by smell, could not recognize again by holding its uniqueness firmly in his memory. He had gathered tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of specific smells, and kept them so clearly, so randomly at his disposal, that he could not only recall them when he smelled them again, but could also actually smell them simply upon recollection. And what was more, he even knew how by sheer imagination to arrange new combinations of them, to the point where he created odors that did not exist in the real world. It was as if he were an autodidact possessed of a huge vocabulary of odors that enabled him to form at will great numbers of smelled sentences. And at an age when other children stammer words, so painfully drummed into them, to formulate their first very inadequate sentences describing the world. Perhaps the closest analogy to his talent is the musical Wunderkind, who has heard his way inside melodies and harmonies to the alphabet of individual tones, and now composes completely new melodies and harmonies all on his own. With the one difference, however, that the alphabet of odors is incomparably larger and more nuanced than that of tones, and with the additional difference that the creative activity of Grenouille the Wunderkind took place only inside him and could be perceived by no other than himself. To the world he appeared to grow ever more secretive. What he loved most was to rove alone through the northern parts of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, through vegetable gardens and vineyards, across meadows. Sometimes he did not come home in the evening, remained missing for days. The rod of punishment awaiting him he bore without a whimper of pain. Confining him to the house, denying him meals, sentencing him to hard labor, nothing could change his behavior. 18 months of sporadic attendance at the parish school of Notre-Dame de Bonsecours had no observable effect. He learned to spell a little and to write his own name, nothing more. His teacher considered him feeble-minded. Madame Gaillard, however, noticed that he had certain abilities and qualities that were highly unusual, if not to say supernatural, and childish fear of darkness and night seemed to be totally foreign to him. You could send him at any time on an errand to the cellar, where other children hardly dared go even with a lantern, or out to the shed to fetch wood on the blackest night. And he never took a light with him, and still found his way around, and immediately brought back what was demanded, without making one wrong move. Not a stumble, not one thing knocked over. More remarkable still, Madame Gaillard thought she had discovered his apparent ability to see right through paper, cloth, wood, even through brick walls and locked doors. Without ever entering the dormitory, he knew how many of her wards, and which ones, were in there. He knew if there was a worm in the cauliflower before the head was split open, and once, when she had hidden her money so well that she couldn't find it herself, she kept changing her hiding places, he pointed without a second's search to a spot behind a fireplace beam, and there it was. He could even see into the future, because he would infallibly predict the approach of a visitor long before the person arrived, or of a thunderstorm when there was not the least cloud in the sky. Of course, he could not see any of these things with his eyes, but rather caught their scents with a nose that from day to day smelled such things more keenly and precisely. The worm in the cauliflower, the money behind a beam, and people on the other side of a wall, or several streets away. But Madame Gaillard would not have guessed that fact in her wildest dreams, even if that blow with the poker had left her olfactory organ intact. She was convinced that, feeble-minded or not, the lad had second sight. And since she also knew that people with second sight bring misfortune and death with them, he made her increasingly nervous. What made her more nervous still was the unbearable thought of living under the same roof with someone who had the gift of spotting hidden money behind walls and beams. And once she had discovered that Grenouille possessed this dreadful ability, she set about getting rid of him. And it just so happened that at about the same time, Grenouille had turned 8, the cloister of Saint-Méry, without mention of the reason, ceased to pay its yearly fee. Madame did not dun them. For appearance's sake she waited an additional week, and when the money owed her still had not appeared, she took the lad by the hand and walked with him into the city. She was acquainted with a tanner named Grimal, who lived near the river in the Rue de la Mortellerie, and had a notorious need for young labourers, not for regular apprentices and journeymen, but for cheap coolies. There were certain jobs in the trade, scraping the meat off rotting hides, mixing the poisonous tanning fluids and dyes, producing caustic lies, so perilous that, if possible, a responsible tanning master did not waste his skilled workers on them, but instead used unemployed riffraff, tramps, or indeed stray children, about whom there would be no inquiry in dubious situations. Madame Gaillard knew, of course, that by all normal standards Grenouille would have no chance of survival in Grimal's tannery. But she was not a woman who bothered herself about such things. She had, after all, done her duty. Her custodianship was ended. What happened to her ward from here on was not her affair. If he made it through, well and good. If he died, that was well and good too. The main thing was that it all be done legally, and so she had Monsieur Grimal provide her with a written receipt for the boy she was handing over to him, gave him in return a receipt for her brokerage fee of 15 francs, and set out again for home in the Rue de Charonne. She felt not the slightest twinge of conscience. On the contrary, she thought her actions not merely legal but also just, for if a child for whom no one was paying were to stay on with her, it would necessarily be at the expense of the other children, or, worse, at her own expense, endangering the future of the other children, or, worse, her own future, that is, her own private and sheltered death, which was the only thing that she still desired from life. Since we are to leave Madame Gaillard behind us at this point in our story and shall not meet her again, we shall take a few sentences to describe the end of her days. Although dead in her heart since childhood, Madame unfortunately lived to be very, very old. In 1782, just short of her 70th birthday, she gave up her business, purchased her annuity as planned, sat in her little house, and waited for death. But death did not come. What came in its place was something not a soul in the world could have anticipated. A revolution, a rapid transformation of all social, moral, and transcendental affairs. At first this revolution had no effect on Madame Gaillard's personal fate, but then, she was almost 80 by now, all at once the man who held her annuity had to emigrate, was stripped of his holdings, and forced to auction off his possessions to a trouser manufacturer. For a while it looked as if even this change would have no fatal effect on Madame Gaillard, for the trouser manufacturer continued to pay her annuity punctually. But then came the day when she no longer received her money in the form of hard coin, but as little slips of printed paper, and that marked the beginning of her economic downfall. Within 2 years, the annuity was no longer worth enough to pay for her firewood. Madame was forced to sell her house at a ridiculously low price, since suddenly there were thousands of other people who also had to sell their houses, and once again she received in return only these stupid slips of paper, and once again, within 2 years, they were as good as worthless, and by 1797, she was nearing 90 now, She had lost her entire fortune, scraped together from almost a century of hard work, and was living in a tiny furnished room in the Rue de Coquille. And only then, 10, 20 years too late, did death arrive, in the form of a protracted bout with a cancer that grabbed Madame by the throat, robbing her first of her appetite and then of her voice, so that she could raise not one word of protest as they carted her off to the Hôtel Dieu. There they put her in a ward populated with hundreds of the mortally ill, the same ward in which her husband had died, laid her in a bed shared with total strangers, pressing body upon body with 5 other women, and for 3 long weeks let her die in public view. She was then sewn into a sack, tossed onto a tumbril at 4 in the morning with 50 other corpses, to the faint tinkle of a bell, driven to the newly founded cemetery of Clamart, a mile beyond the city gates, and there laid in her final resting place, a mass grave beneath a thick layer of quicklime. This was in the year 1799. Thank God Madame had suspected nothing of the fate awaiting her as she walked home that day in 1746, leaving Grenouille and our story behind. She might possibly have lost her faith in justice, and with it the only meaning that she could make of life. From his first glance at Monsieur Grimal, no, from the first breath that sniffed in the odor enveloping Grimal, Grenouille knew that this man was capable of thrashing him to death for the least infraction. His life was worth precisely as much as the work he could accomplish, and consisted only of whatever utility Grimal ascribed to it. And so Grenouille came to heel, never once making an attempt to resist. With each new day, he would bottle up inside himself the energies of his defiance and contumacy, and expend them solely to survive the impending ice age in his tick-like way. Tough, uncomplaining, inconspicuous, he tended the light of life's hopes as a very small but carefully nourished flame. He was a paragon of docility, frugality, and diligence in his work, obeyed implicitly, and appeared satisfied with every meal offered. In the evening he meekly let himself be locked up in a closet off to one side of the tannery floor, where tools were kept and the raw, salted hides were hung. There he slept on the hard, bare, earthen floor. During the day he worked as long as there was light, 8 hours in winter, 14, 15, 16 hours in summer. He scraped the meat from bestially stinking hides, watered them down, plucked them, limed, baited, and fulled them, rubbed them down with pickling dung, chopped wood, stripped bark from birch and yew, climbed down into the tanning pits filled with caustic fumes, layered the hides and pelts just as the journeymen ordered him, spread them with smashed gall nuts, covered this ghastly funeral pyre with yew branches and earth. Years later he would have to dig them up again and retrieve these mummified hide carcasses, now tanned leather, from their grave. When he was not burying or digging up hides, he was hauling water. For months on end he hauled water up from the river, always in 2 buckets, hundreds of bucketfuls a day, for tanning requires vast quantities of water, for soaking, for boiling, for dyeing. For months on end the water hauling left him without a dry stitch on his body. By evening his clothes were dripping wet, and his skin was cold and swollen like a soaked chamois. After 1 year of an existence more animal than human, he contracted anthrax, a disease feared by tanners and usually fatal. Grimal had already written him off and was looking around for a replacement. Not without regret, by the way, for he had never before had a more docile and productive worker than this Grenouille. But contrary to all expectation, Grenouille survived the illness. All he bore from it were scars from the large black carbuncles behind his ears and on his hands and cheeks, leaving him disfigured and even uglier than he had been before. It also left him immune to anthrax, an invaluable advantage, so that now he could strip the foulest hides with cut and bleeding hands and still run no danger of reinfection. This set him apart not only from the apprentices and journeymen, but also from his own potential successors. And because he could no longer be so easily replaced as before, the value of his work, and thus the value of his life, increased. Suddenly he no longer had to sleep on bare earth, but was allowed to build himself a plank bed in the closet, was given straw to scatter over it, and a blanket of his own. He was no longer locked in at bedtime. His food was more adequate. Grimal no longer kept him as just any animal, but as a useful house pet. When he was 12, Grimal gave him half of Sunday off, and at 13 he was even allowed to go out on weekend evenings for an hour after work and do whatever he liked. He had triumphed, for he was alive, and he possessed a small quantum of freedom sufficient for survival. The days of his hibernation were over. Grenouille, the tick, stirred again. He caught the scent of morning. He was seized with an urge to hunt. The greatest preserve for odors in the world stood open before him. The city of Paris. It was like living in utopia. The adjacent neighborhoods of Saint-Jacques-de-la-Boucherie and Saint-Eustache were a wonderland. In the narrow side streets off the Rue Saint-Denis and the Rue Saint-Martin, people lived so densely packed, each house so tightly pressed to the next 5, 6 stories high, that you could not see the sky, and the air at ground level formed damp canals where odors congealed. It was a mixture of human and animal smells, of water and stone, and ashes and leather, of soap and fresh-baked bread and eggs boiled in vinegar, of noodles and smoothly polished brass, of sage and ale and tears, of grease and soggy straw and dry straw. Thousands upon thousands of odors formed an invisible gruel that filled the street ravines, only seldom evaporating above the rooftops and never from the ground below. The people who lived there no longer experienced this gruel as a special smell. It had arisen from them, and they had been steeped in it over and over again. It was, after all, the very air they breathed and from which they lived. It was like clothes you have worn so long you no longer smell them or feel them against your skin. Grenouille, however, smelled it all as if for the first time. And he did not merely smell the mixture of odors in the aggregate, but he dissected it analytically into its smallest and most remote parts and pieces. His discerning nose unraveled the knot of vapor and stench into single strands of unitary odors that could not be unthreaded further. Unwinding and spinning out these threads gave him unspeakable joy. He would often just stand there, leaning against a wall or crouching in a dark corner, his eyes closed, his mouth half open, and nostrils flaring wide, quiet as a feeding pike in a great dark, slowly moving current. And when at last a puff of air would toss a delicate thread of scent his way, he would lunge at it and not let go. Then he would smell at just this one odor, holding it tight, pulling it into himself and preserving it for all time. The odor might be an old acquaintance or a variation on one. It could be a brand new one as well, with hardly any similarity to anything he had ever smelled, let alone seen till that moment. The odor of pressed silk, for example, the odor of wild thyme tea, the odor of brocade embroidered with silver thread, the odor of cork from a bottle of vintage wine, the odor of a tortoise-shell comb. Grenouille was out to find such odors still unknown to him. He hunted them down with the passion and patience of an angler and stored them up inside him. When he had smelled his fill of the thick gruel of the streets, he would go to airier terrain, where the odors were thinner, mixing with the wind as they unfurled, much as perfume does. To the market of Les Halles, for instance, where the odors of the day lived on into the evening, invisibly but ever so distinctly, as if the vendors still swarmed among the crowd, as if the baskets still stood there stuffed full of vegetables and eggs, or the casks full of wine and vinegar, the sacks with their spices and potatoes and flour, the crates of nails and screws, the meat tables, the tables full of cloth and dishes and shoe soles, and all the hundreds of other things sold there during the day. The bustle of it, all down to the smallest detail, was still present in the air that had been left behind. Grenouille saw the whole market smelling, if it can be put that way. And he smelled it more precisely than many people could see it, for his perception was perception after the fact, and thus of a higher order. an essence, a spirit of what had been, something undisturbed by the everyday accidents of the moment, like noise, glare, or the nauseating press of living human beings. Or he would go to the spot where they had beheaded his mother, to the Place de Grève, which stuck out to lick the river like a huge tongue. Here lay the ships, pulled up onto shore or moored to posts, and they smelled of coal and grain and hay and damp ropes. And from the west, via this one passage cut through the city by the river, came a broad current of wind bringing with it the odours of the country, of the meadows around Neuilly, of the forest between Saint-Germain and Versailles, of far-off cities like Rouen or Caen, and sometimes of the sea itself. The sea smelled like a sail whose billows had caught up water, salt, and a cold sun. It had a simple smell, the sea, but at the same time it smelled immense and unique, so much so that Grenouille hesitated to dissect the odours into fishy, salty, watery, seaweedy, fresh airy, and so on. He preferred to leave the smell of the sea blended together, preserving it as a unit in his memory, relishing it whole. The smell of the sea pleased him so much that he wanted one day to take it in, pure and unadulterated, in such quantities that he could get drunk on it. And later, when he learned from stories how large the sea is, and that you can sail upon it in ships for days on end without ever seeing land, nothing pleased him more than the image of himself sitting high up in the crow's nest of the foremost mast on such a ship, gliding on through the endless smell of the sea, which really was no smell, but a breath, an exhalation of breath, the end of all smells, dissolving with pleasure in that breath. But it was never to be, for Grenouille, who stood there on the river bank at the Place de Grève, steadily breathing in and out the scraps of sea breeze that he could catch in his nose, would never in his life see the sea, the real sea, the immense ocean that lay to the west, and would never be able to mingle himself with its smell. He had soon so thoroughly smelled out the quarter between Saint-Eustache and the Hôtel de Ville that he could find his way around it by pitch-dark night. And so he expanded his hunting grounds, first westwards to the Faubourg Saint-Honoré, then out along the Rue Saint-Antoine to the Bastille, and finally across to the other bank of the river, into the quarters of the Sorbonne and the Faubourg Saint-Germain, where the rich people lived. Through the wrought iron gates at their portals came the smells of coach leather and of the powder in the pages' wigs, and over the high walls passed the garden odours of broom and roses and freshly trimmed hedges. It was here as well that Grenouille first smelled perfume, in the literal sense of the word, a simple lavender or rosewater with which the fountains of the gardens were filled on gala occasions, but also the more complex, more costly scents of tincture of musk mixed with oils of neroli and tuberose, jonquil, jasmine, or cinnamon that floated behind the carriages like rich ribbons on the evening breeze. He made note of these scents, registering them just as he would profane odours, with curiosity, but without particular admiration. Of course, he realized that the purpose of perfumes was to create an intoxicating and alluring effect, and he recognized the value of the individual essences that comprised them. But on the whole they seemed to him rather coarse and ponderous, more slapdashed together than composed, and he knew that he could produce entirely different fragrances if he only had the basic ingredients at his disposal. He knew many of these ingredients already from the flower and spice stalls at the market. Others were new to him, and he filtered them out from the aromatic mixture and kept them unnamed in his memory. Ambergris, civet, patchouli, sandalwood, bergamot, vetiver, opoponax, benzoin, hop blossom, castor. He was not particular about it. He did not differentiate between what is commonly considered a good and a bad smell, not yet. He was very greedy. The goal of the hunt was simply to possess everything the world could offer in the way of odours, and his only condition was that the odours be new ones. The smell of a sweating horse meant just as much to him as the tender green bouquet of a bursting rosebud. The acrid stench of a bug was no less worthy than the aroma rising from a larded veal roast in an aristocrat's kitchen. He devoured everything, sucking it up into him. But there were no aesthetic principles governing the olfactory kitchen of his imagination, where he was forever synthesizing and concocting new aromatic combinations. He fashioned grotesqueries, only to destroy them again immediately, like a child playing with blocks, inventive and destructive, with no apparent norms for his creativity. On the 1st of September, 1753, the anniversary of the King's coronation, the city of Paris set off fireworks at the Pont Royal. The display was not as spectacular as the fireworks celebrating the King's marriage, or as the legendary fireworks in honor of the Dauphin's birth, but it was impressive nevertheless. They had mounted golden sun wheels on the masts of the ships. From the bridge itself, so-called fire bulls spewed showers of burning stars into the river, and while from every side came the deafening roar of petards exploding and of firecrackers skipping across the cobblestones, rockets rose into the sky and painted white lilies against the black firmament. Thronging the bridge and the quays along both banks of the river, a crowd of many thousands accompanied the spectacle with ahs and oohs and bravos, even some long lives, although the king had ascended his throne more than 38 years before, and the high point of his popularity was long since behind him. Fireworks can do that. Grenouille stood silent in the shadow of the Pavillon de Flore, across from the Pont Royal on the right bank. He did not stir a finger to applaud, did not even look up at the ascending rockets. He had come in hopes of getting a whiff of something new, but it soon became apparent that fireworks had nothing to offer in the way of odors. For all their extravagant variety as they glittered and gushed and crashed and whistled, they left behind a very monotonous mixture of smells, sulphur, oil, and saltpeter. He was just about to leave this dreary exhibition and head homewards along the gallery of the Louvre, when the wind brought him something, a tiny, hardly noticeable something, a crumb, an atom of scent. No, even less than that. It was more the premonition of a scent than the scent itself. And at the same time it was definitely a premonition of something he had never smelled before. He backed up against the wall, closed his eyes, and flared his nostrils. The scent was so exceptionally delicate and fine that he could not hold on to it. It continually eluded his perception, was masked by the powder smoke of the petards, blocked by the exudations of the crowd, fragmented and crushed by the thousands of other city odors. But then, suddenly, it was there again, a mere shred, the whiff of a magnificent premonition for only a second, and it vanished at once. Grenouille suffered agonies. For the first time, it was not just that his greedy nature was offended, but his very heart ached. He had the prescience of something extraordinary. This scent was the key for ordering all odors. One could understand nothing about odors if one did not understand this one scent, and his whole life would be bungled if he, Grenouille, did not succeed in possessing it. He had to have it, not simply in order to possess it, but for his heart to be at peace. He was almost sick with excitement. He had not yet even worked out which direction the scent was coming from. Sometimes there were intervals of several minutes before a shred was again wafted his way, and each time he was overcome by the horrible anxiety that he had lost it forever. He was finally rescued by a desperate conviction that the scent was coming from the other bank of the river, from somewhere to the southeast. He moved away from the wall of the Pavillon de Flore, dived into the crowd, and made his way across the bridge. Every few strides he would stop and stand on tiptoe in order to take a sniff from above people's heads, at first smelling nothing for pure excitement. Then finally there was something. He smelled the scent stronger than before, knew that he was on the right track, dived in again, burrowed through the throng of gapers and pyrotechnicians, unremittingly setting torch to their rocket fuses, lost the scent in the acrid smoke of the powder, panicked, shoved and jostled his way through and burrowed onward, and after countless minutes reached the far bank, the Hôtel de Mailly, the Quai Malaquiste, the entrance to the Rue de Seine. Here he stopped, gathering his forces, and smelled. He had it. He had hold of it tight. The odor came rolling down the Rue de Seine like a ribbon, unmistakably clear, and yet, as before, very delicate and very fine. Grenouille felt his heart pounding, and he knew that it was not the exertion of running that had set it pounding, but rather his excited helplessness in the presence of this scent. He tried to recall something comparable, but had to discard all comparisons. This scent had a freshness, but not the freshness of limes or pomegranates, nor the freshness of myrrh or cinnamon bark or curly mint or birch or camphor or pine needles, nor that of a May rain or a frosty wind or of well water. And at the same time it had warmth, but not as bergamot, cypress or musk has, or jasmine or narcissi, not as rosewood has or iris. This scent was a blend of both, of evanescence and substance, not a blend but a unity, although slight and frail as well, and yet solid and sustaining, like a piece of thin, shimmering silk, and yet again not like silk, but like pastry soaked in honey-sweet milk. And try as he would, he couldn't fit those two together, milk and silk. This scent was inconceivable, indescribable, could not be categorized in any way. It really ought not to exist at all. And yet there it was, plain and splendid as day. Grenouille followed it, his fearful heart pounding, for he suspected that it was not he who followed the scent, but the scent that had captured him and was drawing him irresistibly to it. He walked up the Rue de Seine. No one was on the street. The houses stood empty and still. The people were down by the river watching the fireworks. No hectic odor of humans disturbed him, no biting stench of gunpowder. The street smelled of its usual smells: water, feces, rats, and vegetable matter. But above it hovered the ribbon, delicate and clear, leading Grenouille on. After a few steps, what little light the night afforded was swallowed by the tall buildings, and Grenouille walked on in darkness. He did not need to see. The scent led him firmly. 50 yards further on, he turned off to the right up the Rue de Marais, a narrow alley hardly a span wide and darker still, if that was possible. Strangely enough, the scent was not much stronger. It was only purer, and in its augmented purity it took on an even greater power of attraction. Grenouille walked with no will of his own. At one point, the scent pulled him strongly to the right, straight through what seemed to be a wall. A low entryway opened up, leading into a back courtyard. Grenouille moved along the passage like a somnambulist, moved across the courtyard, turned a corner, entered a second, smaller courtyard. And here, finally, there was light, a space of only a few square feet. A wooden roof hung out from the wall. Beneath it, a table, a candle stuck atop it. A girl was sitting at the table, cleaning yellow plums. With her left hand she took the fruit from a basket, stemmed and pitted it with a knife, and dropped it into a bucket. She might have been 13, 14 years old. Grenouille stood still. He recognized at once the source of the scent that he had followed from half a mile away on the other bank of the river. Not this squalid courtyard, not the plums. The source was the girl. For a moment he was so confused that he actually thought he had never in his life seen anything so beautiful as this girl, although he only caught her from behind in silhouette against the candlelight. He meant, of course, he had never smelled anything so beautiful. But since he knew the smell of humans, knew it 1,000-fold, men, women, children, he could not conceive of how such an exquisite scent could be emitted by a human being. Normally, human odor was nothing special, or it was ghastly. Children smelled insipid, men urinous, all sour sweat and cheese. Women smelled of rancid fat and rotting fish. Totally uninteresting, repulsive. That was how humans smelled. And so it happened that for the first time in his life, Grenouille did not trust his nose and had to call on his eyes for assistance if he was to believe what he smelled. This confusion of senses did not last long at all. Actually, he required only a moment to convince himself optically, then to abandon himself all the more ruthlessly to olfactory perception. And now he smelled that this was a human being, smelled the sweat of her armpits, the oil in her hair, the fishy odor of her genitals, and smelled it all with the greatest pleasure. Her sweat smelled as fresh as the sea breeze, the tallow of her hair as sweet as nut oil. Her genitals were as fragrant as the bouquet of water lilies, her skin as apricot blossoms. And the harmony of all these components yielded a perfume so rich, so balanced, so magical, that every perfume that Grenouille had smelled until now, every edifice of odors that he had so playfully created within himself, seemed at once to be utterly meaningless. 100,000 odors seemed worthless in the presence of this scent. This one scent was the higher principle, the pattern by which the others must be ordered. It was pure beauty. Grenouille knew for certain that unless he possessed this scent, his life would have no meaning. He had to understand its smallest detail, to follow it to its last delicate tendril. The mere memory, however complex, was not enough. He wanted to press, to imprint his apotheosis of scent on his black, muddled soul, meticulously to explore it, and from this point on, to think, to live, to smell only according to the innermost structures of its magic formula. He slowly approached the girl, closer and closer, stepped under the overhanging roof and halted one step behind her. She did not hear him. She had red hair and wore a grey, sleeveless dress. Her arms were very white and her hands yellow with the juice of the halved plums. Grenouille stood bent over her and sucked in the undiluted fragrance of her as it rose from her nape, her hair, from the neckline of her dress. He let it flow into him like a gentle breeze. He had never felt so wonderful. But the girl felt the air turn cool. She did not see Grenouille, but she was uneasy, sensed a strange chill, the kind one feels when suddenly overcome with some long-discarded fear. She felt as if a cold draught had risen up behind her, as if someone had opened a door leading into a vast, cold cellar. And she laid the paring knife aside, pulled her arms to her chest, and turned around. She was so frozen with terror at the sight of him that he had plenty of time to put his hands to her throat. She did not attempt to cry out, did not budge, did not make the least motion to defend herself. He, in turn, did not look at her, did not see her delicate, freckled face, her red lips, her large, sparkling green eyes, keeping his eyes closed tight as he strangled her, for he had only one concern, not to lose the least trace of her scent. When she was dead, he laid her on the ground among the plum pits, tore off her dress, and the stream of scent became a flood that inundated him with its fragrance. He thrust his face to her skin and swept his flared nostrils across her from belly to breast, to neck, over her face and hair, and back to her belly, down to her genitals, to her thighs and white legs. He smelled her over from head to toe. He gathered up the last fragments of her scent under her chin, in her navel, and in the wrinkles inside her elbow. And after he had smelled the last faded scent of her, he crouched beside her for a while, collecting himself, for he was brimful with her. He did not want to spill a drop of her scent. First he must seal up his innermost compartments. Then he stood up and blew out the candle.